did this magazine piece. And when I graduated, a week after I graduated, I went to do, as Linda said, a 3-month internship. I started freelancing, and I started selling. Things were selling easily because the region is such a hot issue. My parents kept asking me, when are you coming home? And I would say, oh, another 3 months, 6 months. Pretty soon I'd say, oh, another year. And pretty soon they just stopped asking when I was coming home. I eventually started working for a small newswire called Interpress Service, which is associated with the UN. And they were very interested in stories that had to do with Palestinian development. A lot of their clients were small newspapers in the developing world who, as you can imagine, would be interested in what other countries are doing to develop. So I did a lot of that, and that's sort of why I learned to speak Arabic, kind of out of necessity. I realized that as a freelancer I didn't have the budget, and newspapers weren't paying. They don't pay well when you're a freelancer. So I learned Arabic so that I could interview people along the way. Initially I was hiring people from Birzeit University, which is a prestigious university on the West Bank that some of you may be familiar with. But even that, I started to just try to learn the language myself and interview people. So I was there for an interesting period of time because I got there about 3 months before the Oslo Agreement was signed. Through the peace agreement with Jordan, the entire span of the Oslo Agreement, in fact. I left in August of 2003, August of 2001, about 10 months after the Intifada started. So I had the privilege of covering that, which was a very intense story where I was on deadline every day for about 10 months, unless I left the country. So during that span of time, around maybe 1997, 1998, I got hired by the Houston Chronicle, and eventually I let go of my other clients, my other freelance clients, and I just worked exclusively for the Houston Chronicle. And they were sending me to different parts of the Middle East. I went to Iraq twice when Saddam was in power, to Egypt, to Lebanon, Jordan, Morocco, Syria, when Hafez al-Assad died, the president of Syria, for about, 35 years. And I had been trying to get into Syria before that, but the Syrians are very careful about who they let in the country, and I think they knew that I'd been living in occupied Palestine. They have a question on their visa application: have you ever visited occupied Palestine? And you have to write no, or they won't let you into the country. So because I was living in Jerusalem, I think they kind of knew that. I had the byline all over the internet, and when Hafez al-Assad died, it was so unorganized for a few days that they even let an Israeli who had dual citizenship into the country, who worked for Haaretz, without realizing that he had a Spanish passport, and when they found that out, they kicked him kicked him out of the country. So in 2001, I decided, okay, 8 years in the Middle East is enough time. It's time to go do something else. So I applied for the fellowship at the University of Michigan, which is a great opportunity for mid-career journalists to have a year where you don't really have to do much. I studied a little bit more Arabic, and tried to make a documentary film, which I made about 3 minutes of. It took weeks to make 3 minutes. And so it's kind of a time where journalists can sort of regroup and get energy, not be on deadline for 9 months. And when I finished that, I came on with the Tribune. That was in the fall of 2002. And they sent me to Tinley Park, actually, so I work out of the bureau down there. But they also sent me to Baghdad, so I have this sort of schizophrenic existence where I was going from Tinley Park to Baghdad, and I cover the Middle East community as much as I can while I'm here in Tinley Park. And so I was sent to Cairo and Beirut when the war started in 2003. They wanted some peripheral coverage of what the Arab world was thinking and how they were seeing the buildup of troops in Kuwait and then the eventual invasion, and occupation. So I did that initially from Cairo, and I was in Cairo when the statue came down, and all the Egyptians were floored because they thought that the Arab fighters were, sort of staving off the U.S. Army. So there was a lot of surprise and shock that the war had only lasted about 3 weeks. Then I went to Beirut, and they sort of that atmosphere was a lot of nervousness because I think Syria was looking at the situation in Iraq and thinking, this is changing the dynamic of the region and what's going to happen to Syria in the future, which obviously influences Lebanon. So that was, I did a few stories out of there, not a lot of news coming out of there. I think I might have been the only Western journalist who was actually in Beirut when everyone else was crossing the border from Kuwait into Basra. You guys know, just in case, we're going from Kuwait City down here into Basra and then north to Baghdad. So the first time that I went to Iraq after the fall of the Saddam Hussein's regime, it was in September of 2003, and the insurgency had just started to figure out what it was doing, who was where, how to run weapons, how to run money, just sort of getting their bearings after being kind of dispersed and discombobulated after the fall of the government. So in September, there were some signs that things were going to be difficult in the coming months when the insurgents blew up the Red Cross and 4 police stations. So that was one of the big events that I covered the first time I was there. But you could still work. You could still get around the country. When I went the first time, I flew in on a USAID plane. It's a process that you don't actually have a ticket on the plane, and there are no commercial flights. So we all sort of gather in Jordan, which is over here. First time I went to Baghdad when Saddam was in power, I drove overnight because it's a desert and you don't want to go in the heat of the day. So I drove. It takes about 12 hours to get from Amman, Jordan, over here to Baghdad, and you get there at about maybe 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning. You're exhausted. The first thing you do is put your stuff at the Al Rashid Hotel, and then you go to the Minister of Information and you tell him who you want to speak to, where you're going to go. He tells you where you can't go, and he basically prevents you from speaking to whoever you have on your list to speak to. So his sort of goal is more to monitor where the journalists go, and they let us do 2 stories, go to the hospitals and go to the site of bombings from when the British and the American warplanes were monitoring or enforcing the no-fly zones. So you had to use tricks to sort of get where you wanted, get what you wanted, get rid of your minder, we called them. It's a translator who is assigned to you by the government, and his job is to basically make sure that you don't leave the hotel or go anywhere without him knowing about it, and to sort of dissuade you from going to most of the places that you really want to go to, like Saddam City, which is a huge Shiite slum in the center of Baghdad, and things like this. So you have to be kind of creative, and Iraqis are really good at this creativity because they've been living with this government, for three or four decades. So before I got to Iraq, the first time that I went, and this is again in 1999, Saddam is still in power, the no-fly zone is happening, the sanctions are on, ordinary Iraqis are really suffering. The government has its back to the wall, so it's a hard government to cover because it's very nervous, it's very angry, and worrying about getting overthrown, or, you know, is the U.S. back in a coup, you know, so you're basically going behind enemy lines. So a lot of the doctors and a lot of the lawyers and anyone with any kind of education was trying to get out of Iraq. So I found this woman in Jordan who was a music teacher. She was an Iraqi, and all of her children were in either Jordan or cities in Europe. And her husband was the only one left in Baghdad. He was caring for his elderly mother, and he also was a famous violinist. So the Iraqi government wouldn't let him leave. They didn't want to lose, you know, an asset like that. So I had to figure out a way to interview him. I went to her and said, you know, I want to interview your husband. And she said, no. Why, they're going to know that you spoke to him, and why they're going to come to him after you leave, and you can't go speak to him. And then she paused for a couple of minutes, and she said, you know, I'll tell you what you do. When you go in and you tell the minister of, it's actually an assistant to the minister of information, who you want to speak to, you tell them that you want to speak to, she gave me the name of a famous pianist. He died about 6 months ago. That will make them laugh. And while they're laughing, you say, oh, well, gosh, you know, could I speak to this guy instead? And you say my husband's name. And so I did that. I went in, I went to the minister, the assistant minister of information. I sat down, and I'm about 5 feet tall. You know, I looked young. You know, I'm constantly, you know, getting mistaken for a college student. Today I was mistaken. I was happy about it. I'm actually 38. I'm about to be 38 in 10 days. So I don't look very threatening, you know, so I can use that to my advantage. So he sort of looked me over, and I said, you know, I want to speak to, I want to write about Iraqi women, first of all. And he said, good. And that seemed to be just sort of like, somehow I wasn't going to be in his hair with politics, or, you know. Because from these guys' point of view, what they're trying to do is make sure that you don't get them in trouble. They don't want you to find anything out on their watch where they're going to get punished. So I went in and I said, you know, can I speak to so-and-so? And he said, well, you could, but he's dead. Ha, 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 ha. And he started laughing, you know, and all the people in the room started laughing. So I looked kind of embarrassed, and I said, oh, well, you know, could I speak to this guy instead? And he said, okay, he's alive, you can speak to him. So this is how I got an interview with this, with the violinist. Then I had to get rid of my minder and my driver. Actually, I only went with the driver, and so I left my tape recorder in the car, and I asked him if he would run out to the car and get it. And while he was out in the car, this man spoke English, this violinist, and I asked him very quickly, you know, when are you planning to leave? And I spoke to your wife in Jordan, and all this stuff, so that I could at least, you know, get some information from him. So that's sort of how you covered when Saddam was in power. So now fast forward to the regime is gone, and in its place is a political vacuum. So there is no government, there's no police. So when you go there, the Al Rashid Hotel that we used to stay in is now inside the green zone, which is like Emerald City in the center of Baghdad, and there are tanks around it, and walls, and sandbags, and you know, it's like a giant military base, but the government functions in there. It's about 4 kilometers square. And so you can't stay there anymore. So the Tribune stayed in a house initially, and it was a great house. It was hidden in the middle of a very upscale neighborhood, and Iraqi culture worked in our favor. They all have big, like 10-foot walls in the front yard because they are worried about privacy. So we were trying to function under the radar and just not have anyone know that we were there, and it was working great until one day around, I guess, May. I'm jumping ahead a bit here, but one day in I guess, May, we were really trying to be under the radar because people were getting kidnapped, and Nicholasburg had been beheaded. And we were going in disguise, and I just want to put on this disguise. I know there are, I can see that there are lots of people from the Middle East here who are familiar with this, but for those of you who aren't, I'm just going to put on what the women wear in order to work in Baghdad now, which is an abaya. And I didn't speak English, and I didn't speak Arabic because they would hear my English accent. But I put on this, it's called a hijab, and you put this on. Men have a disadvantage because, especially the blonde reporters, the blonde men, they can't do anything about it. The men are all growing beards, but you can't really do anything about the fact that you've got blonde hair. So I'd put this on, and all the women were doing this. You put on, and I can pass this around if you guys want to see it, but we put on this, and but inside out, but you wouldn't know. So you would wear this when you're, I don't know if you guys can see this, but you would wear this when you're outside the house because you're trying to make sure that you can really, really blend in. You don't just sort of blend in, or you don't have people go, hey. You just don't want anything like that. So it's very difficult to cover Baghdad right now. It's hard to get from one place to another. The streets are very unsafe. And the last time I was there was from April until June of last year. The last 16 days that I was there was a bombing every day, which we're now very familiar with because there's a bombing pretty much every day. There has been pretty much every day since I left. But so sometimes your disguise works. I was standing outside the green zone once in this, not the black abaya, but just the hijab. And an Iraqi asked me for a pen in Arabic, and I said, yeah, great, my disguise is working, this is great. So I gave him the pen, and then a few days later, maybe it was a week later, I was in Sadr City, which is where Muqtada Sadr was sort of staging a little mini insurgency. Most of it was going on in Najaf. You guys remember this from the news, but most of the fighting was going on in Najaf, and then in Fallujah, the Sunnis were battling with the American Marines there. But in Najaf, it was Muqtada Sadr's sort of rebels. And in Sadr City, which is the Shiite kind of huge slum in the north of Baghdad, I was standing outside his sort of headquarters, which was this hovel that had a lot of graffiti on it, in the black abaya, thinking, fresh from having someone ask me to borrow a pen, and this little 7-year-old kid came up to me and said, "What's your name?" in English, and I thought, oh no. I was like, get away. So there are definitely, it's hard to you do tricks to try to get information now. Like you have a place to go. You never go anywhere in Baghdad without having a destination. We used to go and talk to people in the street. So you would go to a commercial center in Baghdad and talk to several people in different shops, in a flower shop and an electrical shop. Now you go, you park, you go into one shop, you put your back to the wall. I don't know why, so that you can see the guy who's going to come in a minute. And you talk to them for a few minutes, and then you get in your car and you go to a completely different neighborhood. And the reason why is because when you leave that shop, the guy says, "Hey, I was just talking to this woman. See that woman over there? She speaks English," and you don't know who's who on the street, and you don't know who he might tell. And so you don't want to linger in any places anymore. So that's another one of the sort of security precautions that you take. But it's really difficult to work there, and it was too much of a strain on my family, especially my mother. She was just going nuts, asking me, calling me constantly and saying, "Did they ask you to go back? Are you going back?" Until finally I thought, okay, I'm just going to have to take myself off the rotation. I would love to go, and I think if it weren't the era of the internet where she gets online every day and Googles my name and sees where my byline is, I could actually continue going, but it was just, it was too much. So I haven't been there since June, but I've been watching it. So I can answer questions about what's happening there. But one day, while we were doing all of these security precautions and working under the radar at the house, 2 Katyusha rockets landed outside our front door and blew out all the windows, mangled the front door, blew out all the windows of the cars. It was set up so that there was a big long driveway. This is a mansion. It has 5 bedrooms upstairs. Each bedroom has a bathroom. There's a downstairs. We've hired a a cleaning lady and a cook, and tried to run like a little mini hotel, because we don't have time to do laundry and stuff like this, you know, while we're on deadline every single day, 7 days a week. I was there for 10 weeks the second time, so 70 days you're on deadline, unless you're food poisoned. That happened 3 times. But it's hard to find clean food in Baghdad, if you want to ask me questions about that. But anyway, so we had to put everything we owned, all the satellite dishes, which are not a giveaway. Every Iraqi has a satellite dish now. It used to be illegal under Saddam, but it's one of the fastest selling commodities after the fall of the regime. So we took out our satellite dishes and threw everything in the car, and all the neighbors were coming and saying, you know, how come the Katyusha landed there? And they were all pointing at it and saying, oh, Ajnabiyya, you know, like the foreigners live there. And so our cover was completely blown. So we went to the Al-Rashid, what is it? The Sheraton Hotel. Sheraton? Suddenly I'm forgetting the name of the hotel, which is surrounded by tanks, not far from the green zone, because a lot of the guys who work for Kellogg, Brown & Root and Halliburton, a lot of the sort of mercenaries, or security guards and army, people working with the army, are living there. And so the U.S. government has given them a little bit of protection by putting these tanks around like maybe a half a kilometer square, where there are 2 hotels, the Palestine and this other one. His name escapes me. So we moved in there. There are mortars there. So you have to, this is how journalists think. The trajectory of a mortar just happens to be that it always lands between the 5th and the 10th floor of a hotel, just because it's going in an arc, and that's, you know, sort of where it lands. And so journalists stay in floors 1 through 4 and, you know, 11 through 15. Nobody stays in those floors. And we could hear mortars landing in the green zone, which was across the river, all the time. There must be 20 mortars landing a day in the green zone. Sometimes you're in there and the building shakes and you know that a mortar has landed somewhere close by in the green. The green zone's big, but so I left Baghdad on a commercial flight, which was a good thing. This means that, you know, things were sort of looking up. The Jordanians had started to allow 1 daily flight in and 1 daily flight out. So they stopped that for a while when insurgents hit a DHL plane, and the guy landed safely. No one was killed, but for a while the commercial flights were stopped. So it's definitely, it's hard to get the news there right now, and it's getting harder and harder and harder to get the news there because they're targeting foreigners. You know, if it were just bombings, I've been covering the Middle East for a long time and used to having suicide bombings, and it's not really something that you think about, or the odds of getting caught in it are very small. But when they're hunting the few foreigners who are still there, suddenly your odds have greatly diminished, and it ends up being a difficult story to get. So that's one of the big things that journalists face right now, is sort of how do you get from place to place. When I was there the second time, the first time none of this applied, by the way. In September and October, when the insurgency was still getting its bearings, I was going all over the country. I went up to Kurdistan in the north, up here, in Kirkuk and Mosul, and up into, you know, by the Turkish border, down in Basra. I did a story about a hospital that the U.S. had earmarked funds to build a hospital down there. And then for whatever reason, they took the money for that hospital out of the aid package. We suspect it's because the phrase state-of-the-art was in the proposal, and it was $150 million, and I think that people just thought it was too expensive, maybe, people in Congress. So I went down to see, well, what are they missing? And they're missing a lot, actually. I went to a women and children's hospital there that was the worst hospital I've seen in the Middle East, and I've been to a lot of hospitals, but this one had Turkish toilets that were backed up, water all over the floor of the bathroom, so you didn't really want to even venture in there. it smelled like that all over the hospital. There were flies everywhere. The electricity would go out constantly. It was dusty and dirty with flies and no electricity, and there were a few incubators upstairs that were sort of, a couple of them didn't function right, and they were sort of shoved in a corner. And it was the only women and children's hospital within about maybe a 50-kilometer radius, so there were women coming from villages all over and sleeping in the grass outside waiting for a bed to open up. And the doctor told me that they had between 25 and 40 births every day, and they had 10 beds. So they had to, you had to sort of give birth and get up. So for the next one, so I did a story about that, and I got a letter from a reader saying that she was going to start her own, I had inspired her to start her own aid agency, that she was going to, get funds and make sure that we can build a hospital, in Basra. And I'm thinking, she has a huge uphill battle because there aren't even established aid agencies functioning in Iraq these days because people are getting kidnapped. And when you kidnapped Margaret Hassan, you guys might remember she was which agency did she work for? CARE, or I forget which agency she worked for, but she was, a 50-some-odd-year-old woman, converted to Islam, married an Iraqi, had spent 30 years of her life helping Iraqis, and she was killed by the insurgents. So this makes it extremely difficult. Just recently, Marla, I forget her last name, who was also an aid worker there, she had been giving out money to Iraqi civilians who'd been hurt by, she'd gotten something like $10 million from the U.S. Congress to give out money to Iraqi victims of the U.S. Army as collateral damage, they call it, happens. So she was blown up on the road to the airport just by accident. She happened to be in a car when a suicide bomber was aiming at a U.S. military convoy. So there really aren't aid agencies working there. They're not functioning at full capacity. A lot of them have 2 or 3 Iraqis, locals, who are trying to do some work. You can't get supplies in and out easily. The roads are not safe. So I didn't email this woman and tell her that. I just thought, good luck. I hope she does something. But the second time that I got there, you couldn't get around. You couldn't. I went to Fallujah one day from Baghdad. From Baghdad to Fallujah it takes about an hour and a half. And there was a lull in the fighting there, and the Americans had just signed, the Marines had just signed some sort of peace arrangement, I don't know what you would call it, with the insurgency there. And so people thought, okay, there's going to be an end to the fighting, at least for a while. So I went there in the black abaya with a translator and a driver, and the translator did not want to go. Kept telling me it wasn't safe, we shouldn't go. Then kept trying to get me to leave once we were there. Kept getting in the car, telling me not to get out, it wasn't safe. And so we were driving around. I'm looking for members of this new Iraqi army, which was part of this peace deal. Who are these people? Where did they come from? Why did they join the new Iraqi army? So we see that. And it's sort of this ragtag bunch under kind of a shack to give them some shade from the sun. There was some boards over a couple of poles. It really was like a beach shack. And they were in these sort of wrinkled uniforms. And I said, Nadine, go out and see if they'll speak to me. So he went out for like 10 seconds and came back and said, no, they don't want to speak to you, let's go. And so we were turning the car around, and I'm thinking, Nadine's thinking, great, we can leave. I'm thinking, okay, we're going to have to find another shack where there are more of them, and I can ask another group, because I've got to talk to these people. And while we were turning around to go do that, I saw this woman that I know from the LA Times in her abaya, long black, thing, interviewing these guys. I said, Nadine, how come the LA Times is speaking to these people? You just told me that they don't want to speak to us. So we had to get out of the car, and I realized, okay, he just doesn't want to do it. So I spoke to them, and it turned out that a lot of them were, in fact, the majority of them had been fighting, or claiming anyway, to have fought the Marines the week before. And they had decided, okay, I'll put down my guns. We're losing anyway. So they put on their old Baptist uniforms, signed up on a little sheet of paper, and that was the new Iraqi army. And so you sort of wondered how long that, would last, or, where that was going. But so I wrote a story about that. And that's sort of how you work there. Yeah, 2 more minutes? I haven't even talked about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict yet. Anyway.
Okay, then you can have 3 minutes.
Israel-Palestine in 3 minutes. It's never been done, I guarantee that. So, anyway, what can I tell you about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? By the time I left there, I was very pessimistic about the prospect for any kind of peace deal there. Now, remember, I left right at 10 months into the Intifada, the second Intifada, which started in September of 2000. It was extremely difficult to cover it. Every single day you were driving somewhere in the West Bank, which I can fast forward, and we'll show you guys a map, if nothing else. I was based in Jerusalem, but you drive every day to, down to Hebron or up to Nablus or wherever there's a riot. You sort of listen to the hourly news, and you talk to a lot of other journalists, and you figure out where to go for the day. You're out all day long. You're getting tear gassed, so you have a headache when you get back. You come back to Jerusalem around 5 or 6 in the afternoon, and you sit down and write a story for the next 3 or 4 hours. You make phone calls, and you work on a story, and you file around 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and that went on for every day for about 10 months. So it's a very exhausting story to do, and it really hit immediately. If you remember, the very beginning of the Intifada was when 2 or 3, I guess it was 2, Israeli soldiers went into Ramallah and were beaten to death, and then a couple of days later, maybe it was a couple of days before, I don't remember, the Israelis shot that little 10-year-old boy, or 12, however old he was. He was Muhammad al-Dura. So immediately it was on the front page. My editor wanted something every single day. I don't really know I know I'm going to get questions about the prospects for peace there, and I haven't been there since I've been there. I've been there since I left in August of 2001, but only to visit France. I haven't gone there to work since then. Each time I got out of Baghdad, I went to Israel and to Jerusalem, because I have mostly journalist friends who are still there, but also some Israeli and Palestinian friends. So I have to say I didn't work there. I can't really tell you what the atmosphere is like. It looks like there's like things are moving back toward a good, in maybe a good way, but it's very difficult to gauge that place without actually being there. It's very hard. It's very different when you're sitting here and you're reading news reports and being there where you can feel it. You kind of feel the temperature, the political temperature of the place when you're there. When the Intifada first started, when the second Intifada started, everyone knew it was going to start. Camp David had failed in July of 2000, and in August, you felt like you were suspended. There was this political climate of, like, everybody was waiting for the big punch. Nobody knew exactly how it was going to come, but it was not a good thing that the Camp David Accord, had failed. And so not being there, I can't really make those kind of pronouncements, or predictions, where I think if you had taken a poll in August of 2000, the majority of people would have said, yeah, this place is going to blow up. But I'm at a disadvantage now. I can't really do that for you. But anyway, I will open it up to questions if you guys want to ask about the politics or would like to cover it, or any questions. Yeah, sure. Sure, that way people can hear.
Sure.
Okay.
Please, my name is Omar Najib, and I'm going to moderate the question and answer, and I would request from each and every one of you not to make speeches or statements. Just the question, please. Very brief, up to the point. Thank you.
My name is Dean Foldenhoven, and I'd like to know what Saddam Hussein, will he be tried in the World Court in The Hague, of which the United States is not a member of, or will he be tried in Iraq? And Who will try him, and for what crimes will he be charged? It's a loaded question.
No, actually, I mean, the Iraqis want to try him. You know, Ahmed Chalabi's cousin or nephew, or I forget how he's related to him. Ahmed Chalabi is, how do I describe him? He's one of the Iraqi people in exile until recently. With that, I don't know exactly how to describe him, but I mean, he was until recently sort of one of the Americans' favored sons that sort of flew in with Rumsfeld and about 700 armed guards when he went back to Iraq. And he has since fallen out of favor with the U.S. government, and they've sort of tried to sideline him politically. But anyway, his cousin is working on the Tribune. Now, I don't think there are any plans to have anything in The Hague. I think that they wanted to make it an Iraqi affair, and the whole idea, right now they're working on what kinds of laws, because the laws aren't clear there, you know, when there's a political vacuum, and they don't have, there have been a lot of sort of, what would you call them, like orders, or, you know, from the U.S., when the U.S. guy, Bremer, was in charge, he would issue sort of military or government orders, but they haven't had a government until now to pass, like, laws, parliamentary laws, but I do know the intention is for the Iraqis to try him for war crimes, I guess. But yeah, I don't know that he must have been charged. I don't know, actually. I don't know the details of...
He has been charged.
He's been charged, okay.
And he will be tried in Iraq under Iraqi law by Iraqi judges. So it's not going to be The Hague. But there will be quite few lawyers who will defend him, including Ramsey Clark, the former U.S. Attorney General.
Go ahead.
My question is about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Oh, sure. My name is Mary Fleece, and I'm a history faculty member here at Emory. And actually, my students in the world since 1945, we're covering the Middle East right now. And I know you left in 2001, but based off of what you know and the subsequent building of the wall in Israel, I was curious what your reaction was to that, since I'm sure, even if you haven't been there, you still know more than all of us do about the consequences of that. And has it been, do you think, has it been successful? Is it successful in because the Israelis are claiming that it is successful in stopping terrorism? The Palestinians obviously have a different perspective. I was wondering what your perspective was on it.
You know, I mean, the wall is not complete, so there are big, you know, gaps in this wall, and I didn't drive all along it, you know, so I don't know exactly where it is. You can see it when you're in Jerusalem. It's up on the hill, and it's this sort of thing, you know, that disrupts an otherwise very pretty landscape, you know, that has been the focus of a lot of pictures, you know, that end up being framed, and you know, but so now there's this giant wall or fence, they call it. The Israelis like to call it a separation fence. Semantics is a big thing covering there. It's very difficult to figure out what you're going to call things. And my editors and I would have meetings like you wouldn't believe to figure out, do we call it a neighborhood or a settlement, or, you know, I mean, do we call it the Haram al-Sharif, or do we call it the Western Wall, or, you know, so, or both. You'd have these very laborious sentences, you know, to try to get everybody's definition into one sentence with a lot of commas. I know, you know, it's hard to tell whether or not that's going to work. There's been a lull in bombings. I think that there's been a couple since the wall started to be built, but you don't know if that has to do with really good Israeli intelligence, or Palestinians are just not bothering for the moment, you know, if it's a political thing, or if it has to do with this, you know, really with this wall. I don't really know how to answer the question. Yeah. But
one more point to that. The Israelis, they claim they are doing that for security reasons. The Palestinians, they claim, and rightly so, it's a land grab. They are taking over at least 10 to 15% of the West Bank to be inside Israel as part of this war. So you have two claims, and make a claim.
yeah, the wall does not go according to the 1967 boundaries. Yeah.
Deborah, you spoke a little bit biographically, but I wonder about as an undergrad or a high school student, where did you get the courage And where'd you get the passion for this?
You know, I really fell into this. Let me tell you, I was going to be a lawyer, and my parents would probably be very happy today if I were a lawyer. I mean, I studied politics undergrad because I was told by a school counselor in high school that if I wanted to be a lawyer that I could study psychology or political science. And I didn't know what political science was, so I signed up for psychology when I was a senior in high school. That's how I got into political science. And I didn't like psychology because they were talking about how when babies started to see in 3D, and I didn't care. And so I switched, okay? I'm telling you this. I switched to political science without knowing what it was when I was a freshman in college. Okay, I'm 18. My dad has told me you have to go to college in Oregon, and it has to be a public college because that's what I can pay for. So I went to the University of Oregon. So, I mean, really, these are how decisions are made, and frankly, this is sort of how life decisions are made, too. We sort of go with it. But anyway, so I discovered that I loved political science. I really liked, and I wanted to go see the world. And so I still thought I would do law, and I was going to maybe do international law or something very sexy sounding, you know, constitutional law or whatever, until I went to work at a law firm. And I was defending Ford Motor Company, and I realized I don't really want to do this. This isn't exciting. So right about that time, I read From Beirut to Jerusalem. I'm not kidding. And I thought, wow, I want to go do that. How did he go from Beirut to Jerusalem, and how did he cover all this stuff? And wouldn't that be really exciting? And I was 23. You know, so I didn't know that, you don't know, you know, ignorance is bliss. And so I just thought, I'll go to journalism school, that's what I'm going to do. And I'll go traveling with a backpack, and I went to Jerusalem, and I really was going to write about archaeology. And nobody was listening to me, you know, and I was saying, archaeology, and everybody was going to Israeli-Palestinian conflict, why don't you talk to Peace Now, why don't you talk to women in black, women in green, women wherever, you know, and so I just, you know, ended up, I ended up doing it. But so I would tell college and high school students to follow your heart, or worry about the details later, or you know, see what you get. When I got this internship, I said, hey, great, I'll go do this internship for 3 months. Saved my little money waitressing, you know, landed in Jerusalem, got an apartment, you know, actually, it's a much longer story than that. I was all over Jerusalem homeless with my little backpack. So one of my Palestinian friends told me I was a Bedouin, and I was moving from Kheme to Kheme, which means from tent to tent. But, you know, just go with it. You know, you don't know what's going to happen. So if you find something that you think you want to do, go do it. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Leslie Warren. I'm a librarian here at Moraine. My question is, how has the internet impacted on deadline? You talk about always being on deadline, but I look at the Chicago Tribune's website every 15 minutes and expect to see something new. So how does that impact what you do and how you do it?
Well, when you're overseas, it doesn't really impact you because the time difference is so much that the day is over in Baghdad, and you're writing about the bombing that already happened, you know, for tomorrow's newspaper. So it's a little bit, it makes it a little bit old news. You know, the newspapers have to figure out, and I think we're in the process of doing that, of trying to figure out how do we stay current when right now it's current, and yesterday's news, which is in today's paper, now I have a little puddle here. In today's paper, you know, it's old, it's a little bit old, you know, so all you can do is give them more detail, a little bit of analysis, or try to give them a little bit more than what they saw on television that day. Here in Chicago, it matters because sometimes the internet wants the story that I'm working on, which only moves my deadline up. It just makes me scramble more. I've got to, you know, send something to the internet guy, you know, by 3 instead of having until 6 to write a story. For me personally, you know, because I told my parents that I had moved to a hotel in Baghdad because, oh, you know, they just figured it was a little bit safer. No worries, you know. And then my parents, a couple of, like 3 weeks later, I think it was the Washington Post started this sort of, journalists don't like to write about themselves. They don't like to write about what they see. It's not really, there's something about the norms or the culture of journalism where you're supposed to be a conduit for information, and we hesitate to write things with in the I form. And you're not supposed to write stories that have to do with what it took you to get the story. So, but it was changing because journalists were being targeted and kidnapped, and suddenly people wanted to know, well, what is it like to be a journalist there? So this Dan Williams from the New York Times, from the Washington Post, who was one of the funniest guys I've ever met, wrote this, somehow he wrote a hilarious story about being almost killed by insurgents who followed his car out of Fallujah, and he was shot at, and they blew out the back tires, and somehow this is a really funny article to read. I mean, if you want to look it up, but he just managed to find humor in this. And so suddenly it became okay, you know, in the New York Times, there's writing some stuff about what it's like to cover. And so our public editor, he writes a column, he sort of weighed in on that and said, you know, blah, 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 you know, difficult to cover, lots of bombs, and kudos to Deborah Horan, Liz Sly, and Bill Glauber for, you know, handling it well when bombs landed at the Tribune house. So my mom Googles my name every day when I'm in Baghdad. So she didn't see that, you know, she wouldn't have seen that, you know, had my name not been in it. So I get this email, it's all capital letters. So that's why you moved to the hotel. So we were like, and one of the women, Liz Sly, who's, you know, mom is in London, was calling up and trying to figure out how to get that story off the internet, which I don't think she ever did, but, you know, so we were calling the public editor and saying, don't do that to us, do you know what it takes? You know what we're telling our parents? Like, I'm telling them what I eat, that I went to a hotel, or a restaurant, I saw some friends at the pool. I mean, like, I am not telling them what's really happening here. Just leave my name out of it. So, so it can impact it like that, too, you know. It impacts it that your name, if you Google my name, everything, you know, that I've written comes up, and, yeah, I mean, I guess those are the ways. But the biggest problem is that what's in today's paper, people heard about it yesterday, so they've got to figure out, they're in the process of working that out, I think, the industry is. Yeah. Go ahead.
One last question, please.
And I can stay, if people can stay, I can
Real quick, do you see signs of a permanent U.S. presence in Iraq when you were there and since then as you followed?
You know, some of those bases, they look like little towns. I mean, the streets aren't paved or whatever, but, you know, I mean, like, they've really set up camp at, like, some places. I mean, that doesn't mean that they can't be dismantled, you know. Signs of a permanent presence. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if, you know, 3 years from now, if there's a relatively stable Iraqi government, that we don't get an invitation from it to set up a permanent base, you know. I mean, that's sort of diplomatically maybe how they would do it, is just send us a little note saying, why don't you invite us and have a permanent base, you know. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if that happened. I mean, the U.S. has permanent bases in Qatar, and they used to have them in Saudi and Korea and whatever. I mean, I can imagine that happening, yeah. Yeah, that's probably pretty likely. And you, I can...
I would like to thank the Maureen College and Dr. Gruber for actually jointly sponsoring this event with the Christian Muslim Dialogue Group, and also thank Deborah Horan for her inspiring, informative speech. And to tell you something about the Christian Muslim Dialogue Group, we have been formed since the year 2000, after the fiasco of that church being sold to be a mosque. And we've been in business for about 5 years. And I would like to acknowledge a few of our members who are present here. Dr. Michael Vanderweel is one of them, Bill, and Hassan, please stand up. And then Neil Pondenhagen, and my wife, Barbara Najib, who is not connected with me, but she's here already. Thank you so much. Any of you for the next few minutes would like to speak to Deborah Horan about any subject, come forward, and she's willing to do that for you, please. For just 5 minutes.
You want to